It's great to have everybody here with us today. If you're a visitor with us for the first time, then we encourage you to fill out a visitor's card. At the end of our service today, there will be a basket that's passed around, and all we ask of you is that you put that visitor's card in the basket so that we can get in touch with you about any spiritual needs at all that you have, and to thank you for your participation in our worship today. This has been a worship about Jesus. It has been a worship to glorify Him and the great things that He has done, the great thing that He did in taking upon Himself the sin of the world upon that cruel, terrible cross. My friends, it is Jesus that is our life. It is Jesus who is truth. It is Jesus who guides us in all things and makes our salvation possible. So let us continue our discussion of Jesus today by having our Bibles open to John chapter 2 and considering a story from His life very early in His ministry. Presumably the first time that He goes to Jerusalem for a festival during His 3-year ministry. So we begin reading here in John chapter 2 and verse 13. So the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And He found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers who were seated there. And He made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves in verse 16, He said, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a house of merchandise." And we'll look at the rest of the story here in a few moments. But I want to start with this idea of the house of merchandise that Jesus sees in the Temple Mount when He comes to Jerusalem for the Passover. Understand that what Jesus finds here is noise and chaos and arguing and bargaining and animal filth, and worse than anything else is greed and pretentious false religion. For about a month leading up to the Passover, the towns and villages surrounding Jerusalem would prepare for the great feast. They would rebuild roads and fix bridges. They would bleach white sepulchres surrounding Jerusalem. Also, the money changers and the vendors would fill the booths in all the villages around Jerusalem. About a week before the Passover, all of these same vendors and money changers would then converge upon the city itself, specifically in the temple. And there in the temple, if you were a pilgrim coming for the festival, you would be able to exchange your foreign currency, because money would come from Syria and Tyre, from Greece and Rome and Persia, and that money was no good in Jerusalem. You could exchange that money then for money that was good in Jerusalem, so that you could pay two things. First of all, the temple treasury tax that every Jew owed. And second, that you could pay for whatever provisions were needed for the Passover itself, including the lamb and any sacrifices that you would make while you were in Jerusalem. Now, all of this became quite a big business. Imagine, if you will, the business that is done outside of our state fair here in Phoenix. Not just the business inside the fair, but the business outside the fair as well, of people selling glow sticks and water bottles for $1. And you can't even get up to the ticket booth at the fair without being hounded by 24 of these people at every single entrance. Then you enter the fair itself. And just like you might find in the temple in the first century, the smell of animals greets you. The smell of food wafting through the air, strangely mixing with the scent of cows and pigs. People yelling at you from all sides, "Try this, do this, buy this." And on top of all of it, 100,000 people surrounding you, crowding you, shoulder to shoulder, humanity as far as your eye can see down every single street. And that's what Jesus found in Jerusalem during the Passover. Now, I think what offends Jesus more than anything else is the business that was there in the temple. That they had taken His Father's house and made it into a place of merchandise. You had the animals, of course, and there was a great business that was built up around the animals, because if you were traveling from Greece or Persia or Italy or Egypt to come to the Passover, it would be very hard to take a couple of livestock animals with you in tow. So it would make sense then that people could present and prepare animals ready to go. You just showed up in Jerusalem and bought your Passover packet for the week. But there also had to be somebody, if you did bring an animal, there had to be somebody who could verify that it was clean according to the Levitical standard that was set. So then you'd have a lot of haggling. You brought your sheep that you thought was your best sheep, but somebody in the temple who knows the rules is going, I don't know. That's a blemish. No, that's a dirt spot. No, that's a blemish for sure. Are you sure about... So you had all this haggling going on about whether or not animals were suitable to be sacrificed. And then you had the money changers themselves. The money changers. Money flowing in from all over the world had to be converted into currency that was suitable in Jerusalem. And there were fees associated with all of it. Just to change your money cost a certain fee. And then to pay your temple tax, you had to have a processing fee that went along with that, of course. But the temple tax you owed in exact change. And if you did not have exact change for your temple tax, not only did they charge you for the tax itself, the processing fee, but they charged you to get your change back from them. So there was a charge every single time money was changed between hands in Jerusalem. And somebody, or a lot of somebodies, were making a great profit from the whole thing. Now moving on here, Jesus' extreme response, I think, is justified, especially when you consider that this response was expected of the Messiah. Go to Malachi chapter 3, for example, in the Old Testament. And notice in Malachi chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he'll clear the way before me. The Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple. Isn't that how it's presented in John chapter 2? Jesus of Nazareth was a nobody from Galilee. No one knew who Jesus was. And suddenly, he's changing water into wine and preaching the gospel of the coming kingdom and showing up in Jerusalem, turning tables over out of nowhere. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he's coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, verse 2? And who can stand up when he appears? For he, that is the Messiah, is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. And he will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver. And he'll purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, as in the days of old and as in the former years. Is that not a prophecy about Jesus cleansing the temple? To purify the Levites who only saw the sacrificial system as a way to earn money, to purify the sacrifice that in God's eyes represented the cleansing of people of their sins, and all it had become was a business exchange. Vendors like at the county fair selling you funnel cakes for the price of your soul. And the Messiah will come, and he'll burn all of that to the ground and replace it with what God actually wants. Refiner's fire, refining silver and gold to be prepared for the Lord. Jeremiah chapter 23 verses 11 and 12 also illustrates this. Psalm 69 and verse 9, Zeal for thy house has consumed me. So anybody who knew anything about the Messiah should not have been surprised when the Messiah showed up and did exactly what God said he would, to fix the problem in the temple. Now moving on. We might think that it's a bit of an extreme response that Jesus has. Yes, we can understand that he's upset, but just because you're upset, does it make it okay to turn tables over? I've always liked the meme that you see thrown out on Facebook every now and then where somebody says, When someone tells you what would Jesus do, simply reply that making a whip and turning tables over is not out of the realm of possibility. But is he being unreasonable here? Is this simply an act of rage and violence that we ought not to consider in character with the rest of Jesus' life? Well, like I said, if you knew anything about the Messiah, you knew that when the Messiah would come, he would be a zealous figure. You also knew that when the Messiah came, it was not an easy job that he was tasked with. He was not coming to tell everybody they were doing things right. The Messiah was not coming to comfort everybody, to make everyone feel okay with the way the system was working. You knew that the Messiah was coming to change something. Now, maybe they thought he was coming to turn tables over, proverbially speaking. They didn't know he was going to come and literally turn tables over. But he sure did. And he drove them out along with all of their wares. He drove the vendors out along with all of their products, stuff. They're hawking T-shirts of your time in Jerusalem. I went to the Passover and all I got was this T-shirt, right? And he sends them out of his Father's house, because his Father's house is a place of prayer. His Father's house is a place of honor and glory to God. His Father's house is a place of sacrifice and worship, not a place of merchandise. Now, we need to be careful that we don't believe that we're allowed to turn tables over and make whips given every circumstance that bothers us as well. But I do think there's a great lesson to be learned, that when faced with an extreme circumstance, never feel like extreme response is out of the question. After all, it was Jesus himself who said that when you face temptation and that temptation overtakes you in some way, it is Jesus himself who said in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount 29 and 30 that if sin causes you, or if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And if your right hand causes you to sin, tear it off. Extreme circumstances do call for an extreme response. And sometimes I think in our culture today, I think Christians feel like they have to be so friendly and diplomatic when faced with the problem of sin in the world. Now, don't turn over the tables of your neighbor's house if you find out that he's committing some kind of a sin against you. That's certainly not what I'm saying. I don't think that's what Jesus expects. But do you have the zeal for things pertaining to God? Zeal for your spiritual Father's house? That you would turn your life over. That you would turn other people's lives over so that you can show them what it truly means to be devoted to God. So as we move on in our story here, let's go back to John chapter 2, and I want to read a few more verses. Pick up in the text here, and in verse 17. His disciples remembered that it was written, of course, in Psalm 69, verse 9, "Zeal for thy house will consume me." The Jews therefore answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us, seeing that you do these things?" And I believe that verse 18 is referring, by the way, to the temple leadership, not to the Jews in general, but specifically to the temple leadership. People who had a lot to gain from having a house of merchandise in Jerusalem, and people who had a lot to lose if this was actually the Messiah's intent. So he responds in verse 19, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews therefore said in verse 20, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" Of course, he was speaking in verse 21 about the temple of his body, and we'll hold off there for just a second to make some applications later. Interestingly, at least this time that he cleanses the temple, this first time, the temple leadership doesn't confront Jesus as if he's done anything wrong, per se. You notice they aren't accusing him of anything at this point. They're simply asking him, what is the validation for what you're doing? What is the authority? Tell us what sign you do that gives you the right to come in here and turn tables over. Now, perhaps the reason why they're approaching this so gingerly, is because those money changers were not very popular to begin with. So imagine the situation. You're the temple leadership, and you have been profiting immensely for generations now from this situation of changing money and selling animals for sacrifice and selling Passover lambs in the temple, and et cetera, et cetera. Nobody likes the system except for you because you're the only one benefiting from it. And suddenly, a guy from Galilee shows up and turns the whole system upside down and said, enough of this, no more. This is God's house from now on. If you were that temple leadership, you think you're going to step a little lightly right now? Because Jesus just did the most popular thing in Israel for generations. Everybody loves Jesus right now. They might not love Him so much in 3 years, but everybody loves Jesus right now. So the temple leadership doesn't say, stop doing that. You're not allowed to do that. Why would they simply say, well, please give us a sign that confirms your authority to turn tables over and ruin our business here. We just want some validation. That's all. Some verification of... And He tells them, I'll tell you a sign. I'll give you a sign. And it won't be a parlor trick. No parlor tricks. No rabbits out of a hat or flowers out of a sleeve. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll build it up again. That's a very shocking thing to suggest to them. Because He is, in their minds, calling for a total demolition of the great symbol of their national and religious identity. They, of course, take Him so literally that they miss the entire point of the sign. They believe He's speaking of the literal temple, the building that stands before them, but He is speaking of His body. Kill me and bury my body, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. And that will be the ultimate sign, the ultimate validation of the ministry of Jesus. Remember this also, that the temple was in an almost constant state of construction and renovation at this point. Now they said it took 46 years to build this temple, but remember, the temple's not even done being built yet. What they mean is that it has taken 46 years so far to build what you see. The temple wasn't actually completed in its entirety until 63 AD. Now, Herod the Great had begun building this temple during his reign, and he had allowed, by some agreement with the priests and the Levitical leadership there, he had allowed them to continue service in the temple uninterrupted during the construction process. But nevertheless, you're looking at a temple that's not done yet, that is the symbol of their national pride, and Jesus is saying, you know what, you guys haven't even taken the package off of this thing yet, and I want you to tear it down. At least that's what they're thinking in their minds. You haven't even had a ribbon cutting ceremony yet, and I'd like you to tear it down now. What would it be like if you went to a car dealership and you said, I want that one right there. Yeah, that one, the new one with the new car smell. Nobody has sat in that. Nobody has thrown up in the back seat. I want that one, that car right there. And you sign for all the papers, and you write your check, and you're all excited about it. And now they say, well, in order to get the car, you actually have to allow us to crash it in the warehouse in the back first. My friends, the temple wasn't even done yet. It wasn't even finished yet. And here's Jesus suggesting to them, with all the gall in the world, tear it down. Tear it down, and I will build it up again in 3 days. To give you some sense of what that would have involved, this is what the Romans had to tear down in 70 AD when they invaded Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. These are massive stone blocks that sit in Jerusalem to this day. And these are the very blocks that Rome tore down. This is all that's left of Herod's temple now. A pile of stones that no man could move except with 1,000 horses or 1,000 horsepower. And Jesus says, tear it down. Tear those stones down, and I'll build them back up again. It took an entire Roman army to tear those stones down. And Jesus is telling them, just tear it down now. Just tear it down and see what I can put in its place. See what I can do when you've torn it down. That's quite a suggestion, isn't it? Now here's the practical application for me. One of the reasons I think the temple leadership was so upset with Jesus was because his suggestion was nothing more than an absolute trivialization of everything that they had built up on the Temple Mount. That for him to say, tear down your greatest piece of architecture, your great symbol of national and religious identity, the thing that has taken you 46 years to build and you're not even done with it yet. Tear it down. Tear it down. He's trivializing it. He's trivializing it. Now, what if Jesus was to tell you the same thing? To take your greatest accomplishment, your greatest feat, whether it's a savings account or retirement, your accumulated wealth, your reputation, or all of your accomplishments, awards that you've won, a house that you've built, things that you've done in life, mountains that you've climbed, rivers that you've crossed, and Jesus was to tell you to take your greatest feat and tear it down. The best thing that you can do, the greatest accomplishment that you can have in life, Jesus can build up something better in its place in less time. In 3 days. Whatever our society accomplishes, Jesus simply says, tear it down and let me build something in its place for you. Tear down your buildings and tear down your wealth and tear down your national identity and your pride that you have in being an American, and let me build up something in its place that's even better than that. And I'll build it up for you. I'll build it up for you. And of course, he wasn't talking about the temple itself, the building. His resurrection from the dead represents a greater accomplishment than the construction and maintenance of that temple. What Jesus could do in a hollowed out rock by himself, by his own power, buried under a giant stone and surrounded by Roman guards, what he could do in that tomb is better than anything that anybody could build or accomplish in this life. In fact, Jesus' resurrection makes all of our greatest accomplishments seem paltry, trivial, and small by comparison. To all of our pride and arrogance, Jesus would say, tear it down and see what I can build for you. One thing to note here, of course, is that in the text, Jesus specifically says, destroy this temple. You do it. You destroy this temple. You tear it down. Now, later on in Matthew's account, at his trial, they'll twist his words around, and those false witnesses will say, he said he could tear this temple down and build something up in its place. That's not what Jesus said. He didn't say, I'll tear your temple down for you. He said in John 2, you tear it down. You destroy it. Great application then. Jesus isn't going to do it for you. He's not going to destroy things for you. He's not going to tear your temple down, your edifice of life for you. You have to be willing to tear it down yourself before Jesus can build anything up in its place. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind there. He's not going to do it for you. All right. Now, they're seeking a sign, of course. They say, what sign do you show us seeing that you do these things? It's very similar to these passages on the screen here in Matthew chapter 12 and in verses 38 through 40. I'm going to read that one. Of course, Matthew 16 is another great passage, but I like the way it's written here for our purposes today in Matthew 12, beginning in verse 38. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them in verse 39, An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign shall be given it, but the sign of Jonah the prophet. Now that could be the preaching of Jonah, that the sign you receive now is the preaching, but I think Jesus takes it a step further. He says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." And that is the same sign that he refers to in John chapter 2. Now in John 2, he talks about it like the temple. Tear a temple down and I'll build up a temple in its place, the temple being his body. But here he says, you can kill me and bury me. And just the way that Jonah was in the belly of that sea monster for 3 days, I will be in the grave for 3 days. Jonah came out a changed man. I will come out the same man, rejuvenated, reborn, resurrected. And it will be the great sign and the only sign that you will receive. And it stands to this day as the only sign that matters. The resurrection from the dead? My friends, Jesus did many great wonders and miracles in His life, and those things validated His ministry. They were God's stamp of approval upon Him that illustrated, that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that He is, that He was, and always will be the Son of God with all power and authority. But when it comes to our salvation, we are not saved because Jesus turned water into wine. And we are not saved because He gave sight to a blind man. And we're not saved because He walked on water or allowed Peter to walk on water for a few steps as well. We are saved because Jesus raised Himself from the dead. They took our sins upon Him on the cross and buried those sins in the ground. And by His own power, He came up from that grave, ready to face life again. That is the sign that we look to now. Now, with our last few minutes, I want to shift gears very briefly and consider the question of why did Jesus cleanse the temple twice? Because you have on the one hand John chapter 2, which seems to indicate chronologically that Jesus came to the temple and cleansed it very early in His ministry. The very first time that He comes to the Passover, at least during His ministry, He cleanses the temple. And I think it's a serious interruption of the narrative in John if you want to assume that John chapter 2 in that particular text is some kind of added story to where He goes to Jerusalem for the Passover and, oh, by the way, 3 years later He cleansed the temple. But now let's get back here and let's talk about chapter 3. It's a real serious interruption to the flow of the narrative. And I think it seems strange that Matthew, Mark, and Luke would all include the cleansing of the temple at the end of His ministry, considering the fact that Luke specifically says in his intro in Luke chapter 1 that He laid out these things in chronological order. It makes sense to me then that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. Now we've studied these in the past. Matthew's account, at least in part, Mark's account, at least in part, Luke's account, at least in part, give a complete picture when put together of what it was like during His trial. We see different details in each one that give us, again, a complete picture of that story. I do want to mention one thing real briefly, though, in Luke chapter 19. It says there in Luke chapter 19 that after He cleansed the temple, He was teaching in the temple as well. And the text says that all the people were hanging upon His words. And what I love about that is that not only did Jesus cleanse the temple, He kicked out the bad stuff, He replaced it with something good. We were told by our elders during our elders meeting earlier this year, just a few weeks ago, during our goals presentation, that we need to be a part of the solution. During the men's meeting later on that afternoon, Dale specifically said that we want your input, we want to hear suggestions, we want to hear ideas. Be a part of the solution, not just a part of pointing out problems. It's easy for us to point out problems, isn't it? It would have been very easy for anybody in Jerusalem to say, man, I hate those money changers. I sure do get tired of all the fees they charge for this and that. And I hate it every time I go to the temple and I want to worship God and I want to do this or offer a sacrifice. I got to step in animal dung the whole way up the stairs. And it smells bad and it's noisy and it's disruptive and it's nothing like Psalm 84. They probably all complained about the money changers. Jesus did something about it and then replaced the bad with good. He kicked out the money changers and He filled the temple with His wisdom. Don't just point out problems in life. Be a part of the solution and fill your life with good things. But let's ask the question, why did he cleanse the temple twice? And I have a few thoughts on this that I think give some explanation. First of all, the fact that he has to cleanse the temple twice in only 3 years indicates just how little impact the first cleansing had on the temple leadership. He cleansed the temple 1 year, and he comes back 3 years later, and the exact same people are there, causing the exact same problems, and have not learned a thing from him. And maybe that goes to show human tendency toward spiritual failure. That if we're not diligent, if we don't stick with the changes that we make, those changes are not going to last long. And Jesus can come in and knock our tables over. And He can whip us back into shape sometimes. And we'll go, whoa! Whew, I got to get my life together. I got to start doing things right. Stop thinking lustful thoughts. Stop being greedy. Spend more time with my family. Devote myself more to Bible study. And that's usually January 1st when we make all those big promises. What usually happens by February 1st, though? We're just right back to where we started. And the fact that Jesus has to cleanse the temple twice in only 3 years is an indication of just how similar we are to them. The scene also provides a fitting bookend, doesn't it? He begins His ministry very abruptly, cleansing the temple. And He ends His ministry 3 years later, almost as abruptly. He announced His coming by knocking tables over and changing people's lives. And He ended His ministry in the same way. So I think just for that sake, it is very fitting that it should go in that way. But it also highlights His consistency, contrasted with the shifting attitude of the temple leadership. When you read in John chapter 2, they don't accuse Him of anything. There is no violence, no threats. They simply ask Him for a sign that confirms whether He has the authority to do it. But the second time He cleanses the temple, oh, there's no friendliness anymore. Oh, they took the gloves off now. And the second time that He cleanses the temple, they immediately begin trying to figure out how they're going to kill this Jesus of Nazareth guy. Because he's a lot of trouble for us. He's a lot of mischief. So we'll end with this point. Jesus' claim in John chapter 2 to destroy the temple and that He would be able to rebuild it in 3 days' time is the only accusation that sticks during His mock trial. People might have said a lot of outlandish things about Jesus. False witnesses might have come forward and said some very strange things. None of it stuck, though. None of it was any good. But there was something about that thing that Jesus said about the temple that really stuck with them. There was something about that that just really bothered them, that was the only accusation that they accepted from these false witnesses. And of course it was twisted around and misinterpreted and misunderstood. So based on that accusation, based on that blasphemous, rotten claim of His, they send Him to Pontius Pilate to be crucified. And here's the grand irony, my friends. Perhaps the greatest irony in all of human history. They thought they were ending the ministry of Jesus. They thought they were defeating Jesus. They thought that they were bringing to a nice, tidy conclusion this tiny chapter in human history about this random guy from Galilee who caused us a lot of mischief. And they thought the crucifixion was the end of it. Bury His body and be done. In so doing, they actually went back to John chapter 2 and provided the very means for Jesus to accomplish exactly what He said He would. Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days. And He sure did. Now, if you're not a Christian, you really ought to be. If the resurrection of the Son of God from the dead does not impress you, I don't think anything can. Let it impress upon your minds this fact, though, that Jesus died for you, and He died for me, and He died for all people who are willing to accept Him on His terms. Put in short, Mark 16, verse 16 says, "He who believes and is baptized shall be saved." So whatever spiritual need you have, please let it be known at this time by coming forward as we stand and sing.